Are you all ready to do some baking?
I am actually. I am very ready to do some baking. So,
Yeah.
you know what? I will run an introduction here, Ailsa. My name is Tanisha Comers. I am a certified financial planner and the president and founder of KFLA, Canada's first financial literacy agency. Today, I happen to actually be baking. I have butter in a pot, some ingredients, because our guest today, Ailsa McGurk, happens to be a big baker herself. She sent me a recipe for, what was that? A Dutch bread?
Dutch oven bread. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a little too ambitious for me and for this evening. So instead, I'm just baking brownies, which I will leave you the recipe for at the end of this. But our presenter, Ailsa, I will give you an official introduction. She's a lawyer from Underwood Gilhome Estate Lawyers in Calgary. She focuses her practice on assisting clients with estate planning, estate administration, adult guardianship, and trusteeship matters. Before her law degree, she worked for many years as an occupational therapist in Alberta and internationally, assisting clients and families to successfully deal with life challenges and changes. And so because of these unique insights that she's had working with people on the front lines, essentially as a therapist, right? And like a physical therapist is that now we're looking at how do you take care of them legally kind of through the same sort of problems, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Tanisha, for having me on tonight. And I'll try not to get too hungry while I see you cooking away there while we're chatting. But
Right, because when we're talking about having documents in place for, I believe it's decision making, right? That is our focus today. So if
mhm.
you're making decisions for someone, either, I mean, from COVID times, we can tell either because somebody is sick or because they might not be in the country, right? Or in the right location, because there are quite a few people that got stranded.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, Tanisha. So I mean, these state planning documents, there's really sort of a trifecta or three of them that are sort of the big known ones, right? And the main ones. And so most people would be familiar with the will, right? Which is the document where, it allows for instructions and intentions about the transfer of your assets to who you
Right.
want to have those things when you pass away. But the other two are more for, like you were saying, if you don't have the ability to make decisions for yourself, right? Either for illness or injury, or in some cases, if you happen to be out of the country and you couldn't manage things like financial decisions, right? Because you couldn't be here in the country to do that. How are you going to manage those things, or who's going to look after those decisions for you, right?
Actually, an example that's real time would be, I could imagine it would have been very tough to sell investments and or make a transfer of money for all of those people who were stuck abroad and had to spend 4 grand, 5 grand, 6 grand, 10 grand to fly the family home. I know that the government provided some funding, but I know it wasn't very much. And I know that ticket prices were huge. So in many people's cases, they don't necessarily have that kind of cash just sitting there, and they actually do have to sell something or sell some investment or actually move money around. And I'm assuming they couldn't legally have done this without these documents, right?
Well, in certain cases, I mean, if there was an investment, I guess, trading authorization in place, and they were
Right.
able to give instructions, then that could have been it. But no, if there wasn't, and they didn't have a joint account with somebody, then you're right. There wouldn't necessarily be someone who is in a legal position to have legal authority to do those things on their behalf. So yeah, that's a great example, practical example of COVID, right, and how that's affected people's decision making around these documents. So the two biggie documents that we're talking about are known in Alberta anyway as the first is the Personal Directive,
Okay.
and that people would know that as a living will or a healthcare directive, really geared towards personal decision making.
This is the one, like, if I want somebody to pull the plug.
Yes. Yes. As well as the enduring power of attorney is the other document, and that's the document that deals with financial decision making, right? So if you needed somebody to make financial decisions or look after your assets, that's the document that will allow someone to do that.
So then just to clarify and reiterate, if I were stuck in another country for whatever reasons and I needed to access money, I would need somebody with an enduring power of attorney to do that for me, right?
Yeah, so a power of attorney you would
Okay,
need,
power of attorney. Right?
and there are, I don't want to wade too much into it, there are enduring power of attorneys and there are power of attorneys. So there
Right.
are two different types.
Is that important for the purposes of today?
Hey, it's always good to have information, right?
Okay.
And just the difference between them is a general power of attorney. I can be here and say, hey, I'm going to Europe, and I can sign it and give somebody the specific ability to deal with my finances on my behalf for a certain duration, right? Or while I'm giving
Oh,
instructions. But if I got sick with COVID while I was away, and I was in the hospital and I can't give instructions anymore unless that document is an enduring power of attorney, they no longer have the authority to make those decisions because I can't provide them with instructions.
so there's one general power of attorney, which is where I'm still capable and I'm giving somebody else instructions just to operate on my behalf. And then there's the enduring power of attorney, which is if I'm not capable and I want somebody to operate on my behalf. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we dive into chatting a bit more in depth about the enduring power of attorney, because that
Yeah,
seems like
please.
a good place to go.
Yeah.
The idea behind it is that this document can take effect when you can't make decisions for yourself. Usually, that's
Right.
the usual reason for planning for this. And it's a document that has to be triggered, generally speaking, right? So you can either trigger it by way of saying, hey, I don't want this to become effective until I can't make decisions for myself. And then you decide who's going to decide that you can't make decisions. So usually two physicians is often what people would ask for. Um, the other option is you could actually make an enduring power of attorney that's immediately effective. So you could say, hey, I'm tired of going to the bank and looking after things. I could still do it, but I don't want to. So you could sign an enduring power of attorney that's immediately giving someone the ability to do those things for you.
So, as an example, in the case of my little old Bufsha who loved to be at home cooking all the time, if like when she reached a point where she doesn't want to be leaving the house anymore, she just wants to be at home in the kitchen, maybe her legs are sore, she gives enduring power of attorney to one of her daughters, one of my aunts, and lets her take over and basically deal with the finances from there. However, from what I understand, at that point, that person would have basically all the say over the finances, right? Like there's no limits really on their power.
Yeah, so that brings us to another really great point is in the enduring power of attorney, especially, you want to make sure that you've given some really good thought about who you're authorizing to look after these decisions for you, because they do have the ability to deal with all of your stuff, right?
Right.
So they step into your shoes essentially and have access to your bank accounts and your investments and
Right.
your real property. So it's a
Right.
huge role with a lot of responsibility, and you want to make sure you're making a good choice, an informed choice, one that you've had time to think about, right?
Yeah, I mean, just from a financial planning perspective or a fraud protection perspective, that's actually something that comes up a lot when it comes down to senior financial abuse or things like that, where people are given these powers over somebody else's finance and then not, Spider-Man, with great responsibility comes, or with great power comes great responsibility. In these cases, not taking care of the finances as they should, not watching the budget, not watching the investments, and or just straight up taking advantage of it. So yeah, it's important to be really conscientious of who you're choosing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to make sure you've discussed that role with that person, right? So
Right.
that they're not having this thrust on them when they don't know that they were named, right?
Right. Could you imagine all of a sudden being called up and saying, hey, you're making all of my financial decisions now and you never knew that?
No, it's not an honor to get that responsibility, I don't think. So and that just brought to mind too that the enduring power of attorney is really important because a lot of people have a thought that, hey, I don't need this because, my spouse can look after everything for me, or mom can look after everything for me, or my son can do it.
Yeah.
And, really, unless you're, for example, sharing a joint account with your spouse,
Yeah.
things beyond that are just in your own name, or even if you're sharing joint real estate with a spouse,
Yeah.
should you want to deal with any of those things, or any of those things need, action on them, that spouse isn't going to be able to step into those shoes unless there is an enduring power of attorney in place for them to enable them to do that.
So what you're saying is that the law is structured in such a way that spouses can't just go and sell a house from under the other, provided both names are on there. We are in the 21st century at this point. So both halves are basically involved in financial decisions involving accounts with both names on it.
The spouse can't just sell it just because they're the spouse. They have to have the legal authority, and that's given by either the court or through an enduring power of attorney.
So on the flip side, let's say like me and my hubby have a whole bunch of investment real estate property, like we're getting some rental income, and I am sick of dealing with it. I don't like being a landlord. I want to hand it all off, but it's still mine. Would that be the sort of occasion where an enduring power of attorney comes in, where I could be like, here, hun, all yours, you deal with it, but at the same time, we still own it?
Yeah, the person still retains ownership. They've just given over the legal authority to deal with those things. So the other person they're entrusting all those things to the other person's care. And sometimes, just to build on that, sometimes people think that they've signed something with the bank. The bank has gotten them to sign something, right?
Yes.
And that's all they need in order
Yeah.
for someone to take over. And it's very likely that what they've signed is actually an enduring power of attorney specific to the bank assets. So
Right.
while that would be useful within the bank environment, not necessarily useful outside of that environment with other organizations. Right. So with our bread recipe, which we've discovered that we love, it's
the one that
probably it's probably about a 6-hour process, which is okay because most of that time is spent rising. So it's really only about a 15-minute process, actually hands-on, dealing with the dough, and then you can go off and be productive doing other things while it's rising.
So are you saying that I technically could have actually put the dough together if I wasn't a scaredy cat over the course of this conversation? Technically,
although it would be noisy because you have to use a mixer. Is the best way to do it.
Okay. So what's the other document?
So the other document that's really important in the estate planning process is the Personal Directive. So the Personal Directive is, again, that living will. So it's the healthcare directive, the one where you're going to authorize someone who's going to make decisions about your personal decisions for you. And the areas that this person can make decisions about by law include healthcare. So that's kind of the big one that comes to everybody's mind. But it also includes things like where you might live and what kind of activities or schooling or work you might be involved in, as well as who you might be associating with, right? Socially and whatnot, as well as any legal matters that don't deal with money. So they have a fairly wide range of things that they can deal with as well.
Is one of those that's a little bit more loosey-goosey and open to interpretation? Or is this like a hard and fast, no, this is how this person's going to be handled? And again, when does that kick in? Is it just... Sorry.
Yeah. So again, this is a document, it has to be triggered. So you have to not have capacity to make decisions about your personal decisions in order for the document to become effective.
The same as the power of attorney.
Yeah. And so the way it can be triggered in Alberta, anyway, under our law, there's two general ways. One is that what they call service providers would have to do an assessment and sign declarations. And one of those people has to be a physician or a psychologist. And the other one is generally, usually, practically speaking, a nurse or a social worker or another healthcare provider that's working with you. The other way you can trigger it is if the person that you've authorized to look after your decision making for you, they can make a declaration after they've consulted with a physician or a psychologist. So once it becomes active, with personal decision making, I mean, you can make that document as detailed as you want, right? So I've got clients who want to make it very explicit that they want to stay at home as long as they possibly can and they're safe, right? So they want their money used to hire help and modify their house to keep them there. Leave some guidelines around what kind of care you would prefer, right? As saying, you could give examples. If I'm in this type of situation, then I would prefer to have this kind of treatment, or I would prefer not to have this kind of treatment.
You've mentioned estate planning, but it sounds like a lot of this has to do with like living planning, if stuff happens along the way. It also looks like basically these sort of living documents that we were talking about is the living will or the personal directive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then the other one is the power of attorney, obviously the general or the enduring. Now, do you generally recommend that it's the same person for both of these documents? Is it usually two?
It doesn't necessarily have to be the same person. Sometimes that's not practical because somebody that you chose to look after your money maybe wouldn't make the best personal choices, or
Right.
vice versa, right?
Yeah.
But they often are the same person, just in
Okay.
family situations.
Um, Then the last thing that I wanted to ask was like, let's talk about some scenarios for people like who are the people that need to be putting this in place. All right, we've talked about some of the COVID weirdness and the fact that you might want to be prepared in case you're sick somewhere. You might want to be prepared in case you're caught out of country. The last thing is so who really should be thinking about this, right? Like I wanted to do this with you because I wanted to show people that it's not just 75-year-olds that should be writing these documents, but that like you get a concussion and you're in the hospital, like your mom can't sign for you if you're over the age of 18, right? So please give me some examples on your side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm of the opinion that once you hit the age of 18, nobody's legally responsible for you, really, at that point, right? So, in order to ensure that somebody has the ability to act on your behalf in an emergency situation, and we've talked about a whole bunch of different, of those. Really, once you're over the age of 18, you should have these documents in place, right?
Yeah.
It makes things easier. If something does happen, if you're out traveling and you're backpacking around the world and you need to deal with money, you've got an enduring power of attorney in place and mom can deal with that
Right.
back home, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's really not just for my clients who are retired and in their 60s, 70s, experiencing health problems. It's for everybody, just to ensure that
Right.
you've got a plan in place. The things that are really important is it's important to understand that these documents have to be in writing, so they can't be in a voice message, or we've never tried text yet, but I would doubt that would be a good way to do it at this point. And so they need to be in writing. They need to be signed and witnessed by the person who's making them. So if I'm doing it, I would need to sign it and date it in the presence of a witness. The witness can't be my spouse. It can't be the person that's
So somebody at length from you, like it
yeah,
can't
it
be
needs to
like
be.
involved. Yeah.
It's important to get the right information and the right advice so that you get a document that's crafted and is going to be practically useful for
For
you
years.
and the people that might find themselves using the document.
Yeah.
For instance, in the personal directive, a lot of people don't realize that can actually be used to provide authorization for temporary guardianship if you have minor children.
Right.
And if you don't know that and you don't know the way to put that in the document, you might miss that, right? So it's things like that. In the enduring power of attorney, it's important to mention real estate, right? Because otherwise you may not be able to use that document to deal with any real estate or interest in property that you have. So there are little things that would be important to get good advice on. But if you're good at following recipes and you're good at researching things and and following directions, I mean, it's very likely that you could probably put something in place if you needed to. Yeah.
And always you can talk to a professional, obviously, to get a second opinion and see if you should do something better. Like all things, you are on your own in this. And so even if you do have a spouse or somebody else who cares for you, getting the right documents in place is important. As you're mentioning, it's kind of like following a recipe. And if you don't have the recipe, imagining that my husband could step in and just start baking. I think it is important to make sure you have those documents in place. I appreciate that you shared that with me today, Ailsa. My brownies are in the oven. I will try to make it up for you in the future and send you something. But yeah, I appreciate your time here. This is great.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to join you and to talk about this as always. And have a great evening.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Have yeah, bon appetit. Enjoy your dinner.
Looking forward to the brownies.
It was practical. It was practical. I just, couldn't have pulled it off.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to these brownies for sure.
Thank you. I would send them to you if I could, honestly. I don't know if that's COVID friendly though, because I've licked the spoon.
I know, maybe not.